Hello and welcome back to the History 2020 lecture series at East Tennessee State University. I'm Melanie Storie, and in the lecture today I want to talk to you about the transformation of the West during the late 19th century. Specifically, we will look at the myth of the West as it played into the imagination of the American people. We'll also consider the diversity of the Western societies in terms of the different ethnic and racial groups who settled in the West. We'll also look at the development of the Western economy as it coincided with the growth of capitalism and industry in the eastern cities. And then finally, we'll consider the impact of the Anglo-American migration on the thousands of Native American peoples living in the West. In 1872, Brooklyn-based painter John Gast was commissioned by a publisher to produce a painting for a series of Western travel guides. It was called American Progress, and the painting conveys a wide range of ideas about the American West. In this painting, the beautiful goddess Liberty glides westward, leaving the eastern cities behind. She holds in her right hand a school book, which serves as a testament to national enlightenment, and in her left hand, she's stringing telegraph wires all along the way. And then off in the distance, the railroad can be seen, and this gives the impression that civilization was on its way west, and the new technology would eventually tame the wilderness. Just beneath the goddess Liberty, Gast depicted farmers and pioneers who were determined to take advantage of the West's plentiful resources. Then on the left side of the painting are a group of Native Americans who are attempting to flee ahead of the advancing Anglo-American migrations. Likewise, the herd of buffalo is attempting to escape as well. Now, throughout most of the 19th century, the history of the West reflected this type of romantic and optimistic view. It was a region as a place of adventure and opportunity. So let's look a little closer at the myth of the West as it figured into the imagination of the American people. Probably more than any other region, the American West is shrouded in lots of myth and stereotypes. Whenever the West is mentioned in U.S. history, we seem to conjure up images in our minds of a place where lawmen and outlaws square off against each other in a high noon shootout, or a place where good and bad are clearly identifiable. The cowboy, in particular, came to embody a free-spirited lifestyle that's often associated with the West. The cowboy was transformed into one of the most widely admired popular heroes in America. Yet admiring Americans seldom thought about many dismal aspects of the cowboy's life, which was filled with lonely hours of hard work, low pay, and little chance for advancement. Instead, in popular Western novels, and then of course later in movies, the cowboy was romanticized by his freedom from traditional social constraints. So the myth of the West was essentially a byproduct of dime novels in the 19th century, while movies and radio and television shows perpetuated the myth well into the 20th century. And if you think about it, this symbol of the cowboy and this adventurous notion of the West has survived into our 21st century. But it's not just the character of the New West that made it so important to the nation's imagination. It was also many Americans in the late 19th century considered the region to be the last frontier. If you think back to the first part of American history, since the earliest moments of European settlement in America, the image of uncharted territory to the West has always inspired those who dreamed of starting a new life. In the 1840s, it was called Manifest Destiny. That is, the providential vision that America was destined to spread freedom and democracy across the entire continent to the Pacific Ocean. Now, in the late 19th century, with the last of the unsettled land being slowly absorbed into the nation's civilization, the frontier conveyed an even stronger pull than ever before. In fact, after the Civil War, with the completion of a Transcontinental Railroad and legislation which promised cheap Western land, Americans by hundreds of thousands packed up everything they owned and they moved to the Western frontier. Essentially, from 1870 to 1900, there was a steady stream of westward migration. The mythic West represented an uncomplicated, simplistic, and pure lifestyle. It was what many Americans imagined the entire society had once been before cities and factories and masses of immigrants. Another reason why the romantic depiction of the West persisted was the popularity of the Wild West shows that were developed in the late 19th and early 20th century. This form of entertainment had little connection with the reality of Western life, but it impressed on the audiences an image of the West as a place of adventure and romance. The leading promoter of the Wild West shows was none other than William Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody himself had led a fascinating life. He had panned for gold in the West. He had worked as a Pony Express rider. He served as an Army scout. He hunted buffalo for railroad construction crews, which of course led to his famous nickname. But Buffalo Bill was smart in the sense that he was able to capitalize on the romance of the West by forming the Wild West Company in 1883. His shows were part circus and part rodeo, and they were widely popular. They included mock Indian attacks by real Indians, I might add, on stagecoaches and wagon trains. There were portrayals of the Pony Express, of Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's so-called last stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and all sorts of shooting and riding and roping demonstrations. Naturally, Buffalo Bill was always the star performer, but the show had other celebrities too. Phoebe Butler, you might know her better as her stage name, Annie Oakley. She became widely popular for her shooting acts. Also, Native Americans were an important part of the show, too. For instance, the great Sioux chief, Sitting Bull, of Little Bighorn fame, toured with the show for a few months. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show toured all over the nation and throughout all of Europe. In fact, it's reported that as many as 40,000 people saw it in one day in Chicago in 1884. In 1886, it played for 6 months on New York's Staten Island. Even members of the royal family attended the show in England, and it drew large crowds as well in France and Germany and Italy. Its popularity was evidence of the nostalgia in which late 19th century Americans looked at their own imagined past. Perhaps the clearest and most influential statements, though, of the romantic vision of the frontier came from historian Frederick Jackson Turner. In 1893, Turner delivered a paper to the meeting of the American Historical Association in Chicago. It was titled, "The Significance of the Frontier in American History." Turner based his findings on census data, and he argued that civilization had so spread throughout the frontier that the frontier line was no longer discernible. He declared, quote, "The frontier has gone, and with its going has closed the first period of American history." Yet the West had never been a frontier in the sense that he meant, a place that was empty, uncivilized land waiting, a place of empty and uncivilized land waiting for settlement. So the image of this mythic West greatly differed from the reality. The real West of the 19th century was a diverse land with many regions and climates. It was also an extensively populated land with a number of well-developed societies and cultures. There were Native American tribes, Mexicans, Europeans, and Asians. They'd all been living in the West for several generations by the time the Anglo-Americans arrived in massive numbers. The Anglo-American settlers did create new civilizations in this vast land, but they didn't do it by themselves. Almost everything they did and built reflected the influence of these other cultures. Most of all, however, Americans transformed the West by making it part of the growing capitalist economy of the East. And despite their image as rugged individuals, they relied heavily on land grants, subsidies, and military protection as they began to develop the region. So now let's take a closer look at these diverse groups who settled in the West. Just like the big cities of the East, the West in the late 19th century was a widely diverse place populated by Native American tribes, Hispanics, African Americans, as well as immigrants from Europe and Asia. The sheer numbers of people who came together in the West sometimes produced a complex blend of racism and prejudice. The largest population group living in the West before the Anglo-American migration were, of course, the Native American tribes. Some of these Indians were members of eastern tribes such as the Cherokee, who had been forcibly resettled west of the Mississippi to what was called Indian Territory, and this is modern-day Oklahoma. But most of the Indians that lived in the West were members of tribes that had always lived in the West. And these Western tribes had long developed several forms of civilization before any European contact. For instance, more than 300,000 Indians had lived on the Pacific coast before the arrival of Spanish settlers. Also, in the Southwest, the Pueblos had long lived as farmers and established permanent settlements before the Spanish arrived. The most widespread Indian presence in the West were the Plains Indians, a diverse group of tribes with differing languages. Some tribes formed alliances with one another, while others were in constant conflict. Some lived more or less sedentary lives as farmers, while some of the others were highly nomadic hunters. But despite their differences, the tribes shared some similar traits. Their cultures were based on close, extended family networks. Each tribe generally had a type of governing council with community decision-making processes. Also, within each tribe or family, tasks were divided based on gender. For instance, women's roles were largely domestic. They took care of raising the children, preparing meals, preparing animal hides, tending to fields and gardens, while men primarily worked as hunters and or traders. The men also supervised religious and military life. Most tribes practiced religion centered on a belief that there was a spiritual power that governed the natural world. Also, many of the Plains tribes subsisted largely through the hunting of the buffalo. The buffalo or bison provided the economic basis for the Plains Indians' way of life. The meat was their principal source of food. Its hide supplied materials for clothing, shoes, shelter, blankets, and tools. The dried manure, that's commonly referred to as buffalo chips, provided fuel for fires. The bones became knives and arrow tips, while the buffalo tendons formed the strings of their bows. So the Plains Indians, make no doubt, proved to be some of the most fearsome rivals that white settlers would encounter as they settled the West. Yet these tribes also suffered from several weaknesses that in the end made it very difficult for them to defeat the encroachment on their land. One weakness was the inability to unite several tribes against the white encroachment. Native American tribes were seldom able to draw together a large coalition that was big enough to counter white military power. Also, they were frequently distracted by conflicts among the tribes themselves, and this at times made them very vulnerable. Another group who had already established a presence in the West prior to Anglo-American migration were Hispanics. For centuries, much of the far West had been part of first the Spanish Empire and then later the Mexican Republic. Now, during the 1840s, the lands that the United States acquired did not include much of Mexico's most populous regions, but there were considerable numbers of Mexicans who did live in this region, and now they had suddenly become part of the United States. Many of these Mexican settlers stayed. So Spanish-speaking communities were scattered throughout all of the Southwest. All of them were transformed in varying degrees by the arrival of Anglo-Americans and the expansion of the American capitalist economy. For some of them, it meant opportunities of great wealth and added opportunity. In many places in the Southwest, the Hispanic population was able to expand, largely due to the U.S. Army breaking the power of tribes like the Navajo and the Apache. For other Hispanics, the arrival of Anglo-Americans meant the loss of land. For instance, in California, many Hispanics lost land through corrupt deals or just outright seizure of their property. On the whole, the Anglo-American migration created new opportunities of wealth for some Hispanics, while at the same time, others lost power and prestige in a region they had long considered to be their own. Now, in the aftermath of Reconstruction, there were thousands of African Americans who also began migrating west. Some 6,000 Southern blacks arrived in Kansas in 1879, and as many as 20,000 followed the next year. These African Americans came to be known as exodusers because they were making their exodus from the South in search of a haven from racism and poverty. The migration of black Southerners to the West died out by the early 1880s, though, as many were unprepared for the harsh living conditions on the plains. They were not alone. There were many white farmers who were also not ready for the living conditions on the plains as well, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Their homesteads, the African-American homesteads, were often not large enough to be self-sustaining, and most of them were forced to supplement their income by hiring themselves out to other farms. Some soon abandoned their land altogether and moved into the cities, while others became cowboys and participated in Texas cattle drives. Some African Americans also served with the U.S. Army in the West. Nicknamed the Buffalo Soldiers by the Indians, these men built and maintained forts, they mapped out vast areas of the Southwest, and they helped to subdue hostile Indians. Incidentally, 18 of the Buffalo Soldiers were eventually awarded Congressional Medals of Honor for their service. Now, at the same time that Europeans were crossing the Atlantic in search of opportunities in America, many Chinese crossed the Pacific with the same hopes for a better life. A few Chinese had come to California even before the gold rush, but after 1848, the flow of Chinese immigrants dramatically increased. So much so that by 1880, more than 200,000 Chinese had settled in the United States, primarily California, where they consisted of nearly a tenth of the population. Almost all the Chinese immigrants came as free laborers, but there were some who arrived under a type of indenture system. These Chinese workers were called coolies. At first, the Chinese immigrants were welcomed, but as more and more began to arrive, many Anglo-Americans became hostile towards them. In the early 1850s, large numbers of Chinese immigrants worked in the gold mines and for a time enjoyed some considerable success as miners. However, legislation was later passed to exclude the Chinese from mining by enacting a foreign miners tax, and this was something that also helped exclude Hispanic miners. A series of laws passed during the 1850s and 1860s, and these were designed to discourage any further Chinese immigration. And then later on in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese immigration for 10 years. Groups called the anti-coolie clubs were also formed. Members sought a ban on employing Chinese laborers. So as mining declined as a source of wealth for the Chinese, opportunities arose within the area of railroad construction. Beginning in 1865, more than 12,000 Chinese found work building the Transcontinental Railroad. Chinese workers formed about 90% of the labor force of the Central Pacific Company and were mainly responsible for the construction of the new western part of the railroad. The company preferred them to white workers because they had no experience of labor organization and there was less a chance for them to go out on strike. Also, the Chinese worked very hard. They made very few demands and they accepted relatively low pay. The work was grueling and often dangerous, particularly as the railroad moved through the mountains and began using dynamite to blast their way through the mountain ranges. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and this resulted in the unemployment for thousands of Chinese workers. Many of them flocked to cities and established communities known as Chinatowns. Life was very difficult, though, for most urban Chinese, as they usually occupied the lower rungs on the employment ladder. Some did establish their own small businesses. In particular, laundries were established by the Chinese. Now, this was not due to any kind of special expertise, but the fact was that this type of business required very little capital to start up and required only limited command of English. The relatively small number of Chinese women fared much worse, though. During the early migrations, virtually all the Chinese women were sold into prostitution. Once the gender ratio became more balanced, though, Chinese families began to grow in the West. So now let's look at the changing Western economy.